Happy Carolina Day.
Now, let me introduce our speaker, Mr. Jack Warren. Jack is the Executive Director of the Society of Cincinnati and its American Revolution Institute. He's a native of Washington, D.C. and holds degrees in history from Ole Miss and Brown University. He's a former college professor and previously served on the faculties of the University of Massachusetts, Brown University, and the University of Virginia. Jack joined the Society of Cincinnati in 2002 as its director of history and education, and was named its first ever executive director in 2004, a position he still holds today. In addition to prior faculty roles, Jack worked for the John Carter Brown Library in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, I know I've named a lot of northern schools here, and don't worry, Jack hasn't been corrupted with all of his time up north, as you'll soon find out. He also served as a senior editor for the papers of George Washington in Charlottesville, Virginia, and led the production of the presidential series. As an executive, editor, and scholar, Jack has been a leader in historic preservation associated with George Washington in historic places, including his Fredericksburg, Virginia site where Washington was born and his childhood home, and then the home in Barbados where Washington lived during his 1751 visit. Jack has also been a consultant and advisor to the National Park Service and to many other institutions, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the American Battlefield Trust, and Mount Vernon. As you can see, we have a true scholar of the American Revolution with us today. Please join me in welcoming Jack Warren.
Good afternoon. And thank you for realizing one of my ambitions, sort of on my checklist, the opportunity to speak under this statue, and I'll explain why that is. Because it exemplifies a word that's important to us, courage. Courage, determination, dauntless determination to overcome obstacles, a refusal to fail, commitment to the highest ideals, to ideals of independence, both national and personal, ideals of republicanism, ideals of national identity that bind us together to liberty, equality, natural civil rights, responsible citizenship, and always, always, always a determination not to fail, to fight even when the enemy is great, even when the power arrayed against us appears irresistible. Every one of you, I trust, I hope, I pray, feel that this is the spirit that energizes us as Americans. And we can scarcely imagine a time when this was not true. But once it was not, once there was no such thing as being an American, once we had no national identity, there was nothing that knitted us together from state to state, across class, across race, between men and women. Nothing made us one people. The American Revolution made us one people. Our world is very, very different than the world of the American Revolution. I mean, today you can send an idea to the other side of the planet more quickly than you can write it down. You could watch the sunset on the other side of the world if you move quickly and get to the airport and they bring you on time. But things didn't move that fast in the 18th century. They didn't move that fast at the end of June of 1776 when the great Battle of Sullivan's Island was fought. News of that battle, if it were fought today, would be on the other side of the world instantly, but it took a long time by our standards, for that news to ripple outward like a stone thrown into water, the news reaching outward on the evening of June the 28th, after the smoke had scarcely cleared and people began moving back into the backcountry or headed toward Savannah or headed up toward North Carolina with this news, incomplete news, a little garbled, uncertain of actually what had happened. Yes, the British had been defeated, and that was a moment of supreme pride for this city and for this state. But it was uncertain. The British had sailed away. They had loosed their anchors. They had clearly been given a drubbing, but maybe they would be back. It wasn't clear, and the news rippled outward. That first wave went outward toward Savannah and toward North Carolina and toward points north. In the days afterwards, people learned that something remarkable had happened. Within a couple of days, it was clear what had happened, that the British weren't coming back. Deserters had been captured, and news of what had actually gone on those British ships as they were pounded by the guns of the fort became known. And official reports went forth from Charleston by General Lee, by others, that went back into the backcountry, back toward Savannah, back to the north, toward North Carolina and toward Virginia and Maryland and up toward Philadelphia, the unofficial capital of this upstart rebellion. Ripples going outward. And it took days. The information, the news of the battle at Sullivan's Island, of this improbable victory, didn't reach Virginia until the 10th or so of July, the 11th, the 12th of July. I mean, inconceivable to us that something would take weeks, something so exciting. We would pull out our phones and, we would tweet it immediately. But no, it takes that long. And when the ripple reaches Virginia, a ripple is coming down from the north. Another set of news, not Carolina's news, but Philadelphia's news, the nation's news, that Congress on July the 2nd had declared the American colonies no longer colonies, but free and independent states. And that 2 days later, on the 4th of July, they had declared their reasons. They had published a Declaration of Independence justifying for all mankind their reasons for doing that. And the news of Sullivan's Island and the news of the Declaration of Independence somewhere in southern Virginia splashed together. Those ripples met together. And people thereafter who tried to make sense of these two events merged them together. And of course, they were people who had every faith in divine providence. They believed that everything that happened in their world happened because God willed it so. I'm hoping God's will is on my side. Y'all got these funny birds. And that the great disposer of events, as God was often referred to in the 18th century, the great engineer, the great architect, the great emperor of the universe, all phrases used at this time, had decreed that those independent American states would be free. It would be free of the dominion of Great Britain. And that the battle at Sullivan's Island demonstrated that, this improbable victory. That news rippled on from Philadelphia to New York to Washington, who was gathering an army to defend New York from the British, who were in the midst of sending an armada to America. Over 36,000 British and Hessian soldiers, a fleet so large that when it entered New York Harbor in late summer of 1776, a commentator who saw it said, "It looks like all of London afloat." The greatest army any European power had ever sent overseas. And Washington received the news of Fort Sullivan, and he wrote to his family and to his friends and back to members of Congress, and he said, "This gives us courage and confidence. It teaches us that the improbable is possible if we have courage, if we have confidence, if we have faith, if we have determination." The same message was sent by members of Congress who got this news officially on the 19th of July, and they wrote off to their wives and their friends and back to their state governments about this remarkable victory. Weeks had passed, but it was the extraordinary news of the moment. The improbable was possible. It was possible for these weak insignificantly weak former colonies to resist the power of Britain. Now, the war had been going on for a year or more. It had been going on since the spring of 1775. And there had been little in that to give Americans great confidence that they could overcome the British in battle. They had bested, certainly given a drubbing, some punishment to British regulars at Lexington and Concord, but those were merely skirmishes by the standards of later battles of the war. The British had indeed been bottled up in April of 1775 in Boston, and there had been only in that time one battle, one great pitched battle between Americans and British regulars at Bunker Hill. The storied battle of the American Revolution, right? I've spent time up in Yankee country, excise that from the official record. They're proud of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we should be too. The people who fought at Bunker Hill had all of those characteristics I described. They were courageous, they were indomitable, they were determined. They were convinced that they could overcome great odds. But they did not. Despite its storied, legendary nature, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a defeat. The New England colonists who were fighting against the British in their three vast frontal assaults, they were beaten. They were driven away. Now, they were driven away because they ran out of ammunition. They were driven away because their artillery was ill-served. They were all kinds of reasons, and recrimination and finger-pointing. You see, at the time, the consequences of this defeat were very, very worrisome. This wasn't the glorious moment of the Revolution. Now, it becomes after the Revolution. We all can picture the painting. Dr. Joseph Warren dying, a soldier about to bayonet him, another soldier holding back the bayonet. You can picture it in your mind's eye. But that's after the war. The legend of Bunker Hill is a legend after the war. During the war, it had been a defeat, a glorious defeat. General Nathaniel Greene, who'd been with the Army, said, we killed so many of the British in that defeat, I'd have to wish for another defeat just like it. But it was not a victory. And it gnawed at Americans through the long months of the siege of Boston. Was it possible for us to defeat the British in battle? It gnawed at Washington. He worried about it. He wrote in his private correspondence as he took command of the Continental Army in the summer and then in the fall, what the fate of this ragtag army would be if it faced the British in battle. The British, of course, ultimately evacuated Boston without that battle. They got in their ships and they sailed away. And for a brief moment, there were no British regulars in America, and that's when a confident Congress declared our independence. There were battles between loyalists and patriots in the backcountry, battle at Moore's Creek or Great Bridge in Virginia. Small affairs, some of which had great consequence, but nowhere had we fought the British regular military. Now, there was doubt. There wasn't the confidence that we could win, that we could prevail. Now, sometimes we say, and I'll bet you most of you in history class somewhere along the way, somebody told you that the British had the greatest military, they were the greatest military power of the 18th century, and that the patriots were bold, foolhardy perhaps, to confront the greatest military power of the 18th century. But the British were not the greatest military power of the 18th century, not by far. The regular British army was about 30,000 men. The regular French army of that generation, 300,000 men. France had the greatest military, the greatest army in the world, and other continental powers had armies far better trained and far vaster and far more experienced than that of Britain. It wasn't the British army to be feared. It was the British Navy. That actually was the greatest navy in the world. They were the greatest military force the world had ever assembled. The British had over 130 warships in their navy. It was the largest navy the world had ever seen. Over 30 of those vessels carried more than 72 heavy guns. Now understand, we have a picture of sailing ships. We're in our modern arrogance, we have nuclear-powered vessels and we can command the seas, and we tend to think of these things as quaint. Well, maybe a city as traditional as Charleston, who has not lost touch with the past, doesn't think of them as quaint and weak. They were not. A capital warship, a warship of the first class, one with 90 or more guns, heavy guns, 18 and 24-pounder guns. These things were floating fortresses. They were the aircraft carriers of their time, and they cost like it too. They were extraordinarily expensive. They were extraordinarily powerful. The British had, as they say, really big ships, over 30 of these vast things, expensive, billions of dollars by modern standards in expense. They could carry hundreds of men. They could carry enough food to remain at sea for 6 or even 9 months. They had enough gunpowder and ammunition to fight 2 major battles, and they didn't have to stop to refuel because they used the motive power of the sun. They were driven by the wind. They were extraordinary, and if they sailed into a harbor like this one, just one of those vessels, they could command the city. Now keep in mind that in America in 1775, most of the colonists lived in port cities or within a few miles of them, and everybody, every settler, more or less, lived within 200 or 250 miles of salt water. If British America was going to be retaken by Britain, it was going to be retaken by naval power, by the immense power of that navy. Do not underestimate it. That was the greatest single military force on the planet, and it was used to winning. Now, the French had a very fine navy, nearly as big and actually more technologically superior to the British Navy. The French, they used the finest mathematics, the finest engineering. If any of you curse Algebra 2 in school or trigonometry, curse French military engineers of the 18th century, the people who designed those vessels. Much of that modern mathematics in the 18th century was developed by the French and by mathematicians and engineers in their employ to figure out how to build great warships that would send the British warships to the bottom. They were wonderful, the French vessels. The British captains always argued over them after they captured them, who would get to command the things. The British vessels, however, were heavily built and powerful, but the difference was that they had British sailors, and British sailors were used to winning. They had crushed the navies of France and Spain in the previous war, and despite the fact that they had older ships, they expected to have their way in the War of the American Revolution, and they expected to make short work of whatever makeshift forts could be built to defend New York, or Philadelphia, or Annapolis, or Norfolk, or Wilmington, or Charleston, or Savannah. They had every expectation that they would sail into every one of those harbors, that they would send one of those powerful warships and make quick work of that revolution. It was the Navy that was going to win it. And so when that Navy came off of the bar at the beginning of June of 1776, in the British point of view, that was the beginning of the end. They had sent to America the greatest armada, the greatest military force any European power had ever sent overseas, and they were going to begin. They were going to begin here to restore order, to restore rule, to restore what in fact would have been the imposition of tyranny once more in an America which at that moment was free of British troops, free of British governors, which was ruling itself. And there was no reason on earth, no logical reason to believe that we should have won, that what happened at that makeshift fort should have come out the way it did, but it did. It was an extraordinary thing. It was a tribute. It was a tribute to that spirit right there, the spirit of indomitable courage. And that story, the story of Jasper and the flag, the story of men who would not be beaten, men who wouldn't even take their Commander Charles Lee's word to abandon this fort. It's a slaughter pen. They wouldn't, because they recognized that they had to confront and defeat the greatest military power in the world, the British Royal Navy, and they did. And they had every reason to believe that it was due to the interposition of divine providence, because it's hard to imagine that it could have been otherwise. We partake today, all of us, in that spirit. It's what makes us Americans. It's what has to bind us together. That spirit, that refusal to be beaten by great challenges. We face great challenges today. We face technical challenges. We face challenges restoring harmony to our country, unity to our public life. We face challenges, technical ones, ones that that seem to many of us to be, they're extraordinary, but they are not insoluble. There's no problem that we ever said was insoluble. It would be anti-American, absolutely against the grain. You would, if you believe that there are problems we cannot solve, take this statue down, because this man did not believe that there was an enemy we couldn't defeat. Now, you may think with problems that we face in a modern world, well, they're much bigger and more complicated. Trust me, that was a big and complicated problem, defeating one of the greatest military forces ever assembled in the world, doing it by sheer force of will. That's the spirit that has animated us. This fellow, he's the original of Sergeant York and Audie Murphy, and I'm aware that the young people in the audience don't have the faintest idea who saw. These are the heroes of later wars, and they are heroes in the American grain. They do not know how to goose step. Their uniforms are probably sloppy, but they can be depended upon to use their ingenuity and determination. They are the men who climbed from Omaha Beach up onto those impossible bluffs and defeated the Germans. They are the men who found a way to win. They are the men of Bastogne who said nuts when the British asked them to surrender. Germans asked them to surrender to the British. I have them on my mind. When the Germans demanded their surrender, they did it simply, bluntly, like citizen soldiers, like great citizens, which is what Americans must have been, will be. And every day we get stronger. We really do. Because we are at work, in great work, God's work, if I may, but great work to realize the promise of the American Revolution. That everyone everywhere should be free. That everyone everywhere should enjoy liberty, equality between men and women, between all races, between all classes. That people have natural rights which should be defended and protected, and those have no barriers of nation. They have no barriers of class or ethnicity. They are ideals which are universal. They belong to the world. Our pride is that those ideals were enunciated here first, in a world which was unfree, in a world before our revolution which was everywhere in darkness and everyone in chains. Everywhere. Everyone in the world, when our revolution began, was the subject of a king, an emperor, a monarch, a czar, a chief, someone who ruled by some form of divine right and tyrannized over others. And our revolution said no. Mankind was not born with a saddle on his back. No one was divinely booted and spurred to ride other people. And we have been at work these 200 years, imperfectly, unevenly, but continuously, in realizing the ambitions of that revolution. It is a sleepless revolution. It continues today. It will continue until every soul on this earth is liberated from tyranny and oppression. It is the greatest revolution in modern times. It proclaims its truths with courage, with dauntless courage. It nails its flag, if need be, to a cannon staff and says, this is what we believe. We will not be beaten. We may have setbacks. We may be thrown into a fiery furnace, but we have faith in our God. We have faith in our ideals. We have faith in these ideals which are universal and permanent and belong to all mankind. Courage, indomitable courage, that is the legacy of Sullivan's Island, and it is one to be immensely proud of. Thank you all.
Jack, thank you so much for those inspiring words. We'll now come to the portion of the ceremony where we will do the wreath laying, and for the Society of the Cincinnati, I ask Francis Grimble to come and place the wreath. For the Society of Colonial Wars, Colonel Myron Harrington. And for the Sons of the American Revolution, Dr. Scott Buchanan. I would now call on our reenactors to conduct their musket salute and cannon fire.
Take care! All right, we don't think. All right, fire well. Good. Oh, advance word. One. Fire well.
Please rise. Thank you very much. That was the South Carolina 2nd Regiment reenactors, William Moultrie's own. Thank you very much.